Thanks for having me. What a world we live in today, right? Super digitally connected, digitally enabled. It fosters a lot of pace and change. Sometimes it's good, and sometimes for folks it can be overwhelming. And if you're kind of in the kind of classic industries, it feels like the world's really starting to catch up and accelerate, and the lives that we live are increasingly fast-paced. This creates a challenge for a lot of us as we're thinking about our industries and our practices and our businesses. How do we kind of keep pace without burning out? If you look at the pace of change within traditional industries such as space and automotive, it's pretty clear, right? It's already happening. If you look at non-physical goods and services such as education, financial services, again, the technology and data wave are really starting to impact how people operate their businesses and how they actually succeed as a business, period. So if you're in healthcare today, or healthcare facilities for that matter, you feel relatively safe today, perhaps. But things are changing in healthcare as well, right? It doesn't take too far to kind of figure out that there's video visits on a mobile phone device, as was mentioned earlier. There's certainly lots of what I would call digital innovation on data and data science. But we're now starting to see some growing competitors that are from non-healthcare related industries encroaching that space. And it's probably a good demarcator to say, yeah, things are about to change, right? If you read the news and if you really listen to the pulse of what's going on in technology, some of the big Goliaths in the consumer and tech world are going to be entering healthcare as well. So if you don't kind of think that there's going to be a change in the healthcare industry over the next 10 or 20 years, it's probably good to start paying attention to these guys as well as all the small innovators that are coming around. So, if you're like a local healthcare executive, you've been working 10, 20 years in your field, you've been jogging around the track, working with your local competitors, guys with these shoes are showing up now to your track field, right? They're ready for business. They've got a completely different mindset. They have completely different technology. And so the question is, how do you respond to these guys showing up on your track? And perhaps this might be your response, running away from the animals and just going crazy. Certainly you could do that. My hope is that I'll give you a little bit of insight into how to maybe avoid kind of the Jack Sparrow response and maybe kind of make a little bit more of a cogent thought process around it. So a little bit about my background, which will give you some context about how I look at the world and how I look at innovation. One of the first companies I worked with out of business school was a mobile health company called Hippocrates. To date, myself and the company, it was a wired sync Palm Pilot device when we launched. And despite that, it became the #1 viral app among physicians. It still is the #1 app used by clinicians today for drug information. And it was one of the first apps in the App Store because Steve Jobs couldn't convince his doctor to buy an iPhone until it had Hippocrates on it. So it gave you a sense of where you were. This is like, 10 plus years ago now. My next company was a company called One Medical. It's still, thriving and growing. It's about 62 offices in 8 markets nationally. We're the first to define what I would call a national tech-enabled primary care model, the first of its kind, the largest of its kind. And unlike a lot of healthcare service business startups, economically viable, sustainable, and growing at a very healthy professional kind of capital rate. And this gives you a sense of some of our offices. There's one of our offices in Phoenix, but great design and great innovation. And I throw this third example just to show that a lot of my innovation doesn't necessarily focus on healthcare per se. It's looking at trend lines in the macro market. This is a side business that I run in New York, which is basically a digit-enabled kind of tech experience that allows artists, technologists to come and design kind of next-generation marketing events that, again, are very extensible with a very different economic equation. So a variety of kind of lenses to the business, the market, and the landscape, and my hope is to kind of maybe distill some of those ideas into thoughts that you might be able to take home after today. So if you're kind of the blue hiker here, and that's kind of you're leading your team or your organization, and you're marching along the progress of time. What does success look like? I don't know, right? You have your own version of success. You have your strategic plan. Let's just kind of put that as a North Star. And let's assume that you've been incrementally improving and driving along that success path, and you've got your 5-year plan that's looking out. And that's kind of how a lot of people operate their business today, which is totally fine. Then this guy shows up. He's small. He's, frankly, below the success parameter. So if you're kind of measuring the vertical axis as progress, he's starting below you, right? He's small. He's running, but it's hard to say what he's really doing. But if you could look forward in time and say, well, what is this guy actually going to be doing in the future? He's on a different curve, right? And these curves are increasingly common in the workforce today and in society today. And that's an exponentially accelerating curve. And why is that happening? Well, the obvious trend is technology. And technology is changing and transforming most industries, business models, and products and services. And so how do you kind of respond to this? If you're the blue guy, how do you respond to the orange? Some people choose this response, which is, the denial response. It's not going to happen in healthcare. We're brick and mortar. Things really happen a lot more slowly. This is a contracting process. I'm really subject to the whims of my client. There's lots of reasons why you don't have to address the problem today, and it may be the right strategy, depending on the time frame. But this is one common approach that I would not suggest you do if you really want to stay at the head of the pace of innovation. So let's kind of take that one off the table. Another common and totally expected response is we're going to try harder. We're going to invest more resource. We're going to go deep. We're going to create this R&D center. We're going to create an innovation lab. We're going to just spend more resource, maybe aggressively invest in sales. Again, in normal times, that might be the right strategy. But in exponential times, I would encourage you to examine other strategies beside the I'm going to try hard model. So kind of how do we actually think about this in kind of pragmatic terms? Obviously, work smarter, right? But that's kind of just a buzz phrase. And so we want to get kind of a surface layer deeper than work smarter. So do people know this guy, right? So obviously, well-known hockey player. He had a well-known quote. Let's pull out the quote. And this is a nice quote. It kind of captures the spirit of working smarter, which is, good players go to where the puck is. Great players go to where the puck is going to be. So that sounds great. That's a lot better than a light bulb. But the question is, how do you translate that to your work today? So let's try to do that in healthcare. Let's try to imagine where the puck in healthcare is going to be. So let's put up the hockey rink of healthcare, and let's see where this puck is going to be. Well, I can't, to tell you the truth, I can't even see a puck in here, right? It's a mess, right? So the ideal of what we talk about in hockey, oh yeah, there's a player there, the puck's going this way, so you just got to move that way. It's a lot more complicated in the real world, and true in healthcare, much more so than any other industry, it is complicated, and it is hard to see the puck, and it's hard to even know where the goal is. So really, when you kind of take a look at this problem, it's going to much more pragmatic tactical layers, and this is kind of what we want to talk about today. So the first piece of advice I would give to people that are looking to stay ahead of the pace of change is you got to get your head out of the sand, and you got to get it out of your industry, and you need to start really scanning the environment. And it's one thing to kind of, consume mobile tech here and there and say you're an expert in tech. It's another to read the articles where the science is coming from. There's only so much that you can do reading the common news articles. You have to start digging deeper and really starting to understand the environment. And so, one piece of advice I would suggest is really become a student. Become a kid again. It's actually kind of fun, but you have to invest some time and resource into learning. You have to read. Everybody asks me, well, what do I read? I'm in healthcare and primary care services. I only read in tech. I almost don't read the healthcare press. Occasionally I'll stay up on policy, but that's so slow moving, as we know, that staying on top of the tech trends is your best way to kind of really be in tune with things. And the other thing is, you've got to look outside of your industry, outside of your scope. That's where you got to get out of the weeds and into a higher altitude mode, because that's the best way to start to see trend lines, the best place to see new innovators, the best, you're at a conference, at a completely different type of conference, and hearing about a completely different type of company that's reinvented material science or reinvented imaging technology that will then eventually impact your industry. So number one is you just got to be aware of the environment, and you got to get out of the industry. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Is this not going backwards? It's not going backwards. Can you back it? There we go, thank you. So this is kind of a visual of that, right? We've got the blue line, which is your kind of planned course. You got the new guy, and now what you're doing is you're watching things, right? You're not just kind of staying focused on your blue line. Now you're keeping an eye on folks outside of your industry and what they're doing. They're not necessarily direct competitors. They could be macro trend lines, but you've got more of a lens. The second is obviously to take all that data and at the right time really evaluate options. And I don't think this happens a lot in organizations. They're often making 2 to 3 year budget changes or slight course corrections in strategy. And so that might be fine for another 2 years or 5 years. But at some point, depending on when that curve on the market or the competitors starts to inflect, you want to be ahead of that curve. And so you have to think about what are the different options, how aggressive, stay the course is one, and how aggressive do you really want to be on making a change, and what's the conviction around it. And again, easier said than done. Let's go another layer deeper. You got to run the math on it. You have to run the sensitivities on it. You have to figure out how much of the business you want to risk to go after this strategy, how much conviction. The more conviction you have, obviously, the better. How do you get that conviction? Knowing what's happening, seeing what's going on, tracking the progress of things outside your industry to know when they're going to come and invade kind of the ecosystem that you're used to. And then don't kind of ignore the gut, right? The gut is not a bad monitor. The gut is what I would call the great kind of filterer of noise. So if you dabble and you go to different conferences and you see the hype cycles up and down on tech, you might know that over time, this one feels a little bit different or not. This hype cycle feels actually real this time. So you'll get kind of a filtering through your gut. Don't ignore it. It's part of the process to get a very, what I would call, clear decision. And in my mind, it's a decision, right? And this is where we really have to kind of force the dialogue. So what does this look like visually? Well, what you're doing is you're saying, we're going to move up a harder decision sooner. We're going to say, let's pause for a second. Sure, that was our 5-year plan. But 2.5 years from now, we're going to make a harder decision, go or no go, bigger investment, smaller investment, into a new type of direction. That you have to address the changes with fundamental changes. And so what does that look like? A definitive move, right? So there is no, I'm going to partially move, and I'm going to maybe do this or diversify my resources. These are hard moves that require deliberate planning, deliberate attacks, deliberate defenses, depending on where you fit within your ecosystem and where you think the macro ecosystem is going in 5, 10, or 20 years. Your industry thinks in decades, right? So we might be coming in on that time to think about it now, because the time when you actually can make those changes, 10 years have already passed, and the life cycle of your business is already pretty long. So these are things that you need to think about, but when you make that move, make it definitive. This is kind of just an illustration of that. It can't be 2 guys making the move, right? It's a whole team. And it's not kind of like, well, gee, let's try to figure this out. No, it's like it's a scripted move. All these pieces need to realign in the new org. That's how big changes are made in an org. And what does that look like visually? And this will give you the best representation for how that looks, right? So you've been on this path. When you make a big move, this is what a big move looks like, right? You take pain. You go backwards, right? You change the whole structure of your org and business and thinking. That's now on a completely different trajectory. Can you be an exponential business? Maybe. But you can certainly change the trajectory of the business 30 or 50 degrees, right? So you don't have to necessarily become a compounding business like Google or machine learning or eBay. There's only so many businesses that have that luxury of being inherently exponential. So what you're going to have to do to adapt, and frankly, at the detriment of your competitors, is make those big, harder moves, and you may have to do them at an accelerating pace. But the benefit is that's how you stay at least ahead or hopefully keeping pace with the pace of change. Anyway, so those are some kind of pretty simple principles, but in my mind, I think are good ways to think about how to evaluate change within your business to keep you ahead, no matter what race you're in. So, thank you.